Detective Sarah Mitchell stood in front of the mirror in her home office, carefully adjusting her uniform one final time. The badge caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window, casting a small reflection across the mahogany desk behind her. She'd been a police officer for 15 years, but today felt different, monumental, even. Today marked a historic moment that she'd fought for over the past 18 months, something that would either revolutionize law enforcement or become a cautionary tale about overreaching bureaucracy. Her K9 partner, Ghost, sat patiently beside her, his massive German Shepherd frame taking up considerable space in the modest office. The dog's coat gleamed with an almost blue-black sheen, impeccably groomed for the occasion. His dark, intelligent eyes tracked Sarah's movements with the kind of focus that only came from years of disciplined training and an unbreakable bond between handler and canine. Ghost was 9 years old, which made him relatively mature for a working dog. He'd spent the last 7 years with Sarah, and in that time he'd become far more than just a working partner. He was family. They'd worked together through countless cases: narcotics busts in the seedier neighborhoods of Sacramento, explosives detection at public events, and even several missing persons cases where Ghost's remarkable nose had traced human scent across miles of terrain. His record was exceptional. His accuracy rate in detecting drugs exceeded 98%. His explosives detection had prevented at least 3 potentially catastrophic incidents. His ability to track human scent had led to the recovery of a missing child and the location of a fugitive who disappeared into the Sierra Nevada mountains. Ghost had earned commendations, media recognition, and most importantly, the absolute trust of every officer who worked alongside him. But none of that compared to what Sarah was attempting today. The proposal had seemed audacious when she'd first suggested it to her superiors, allowing Ghost to observe a felony trial from inside the courtroom itself. The legal community had erupted in debate. Defense attorneys argued it would prejudice juries. Prosecutors worried about contamination of evidence. Judges questioned whether a dog's presence would undermine the solemnity of judicial proceedings. Sarah had spent 18 months presenting research, citing studies from European law enforcement agencies, and building a compelling case for why canine participation in courtroom observation could revolutionize how the justice system incorporated animal intelligence into legal proceedings. She'd written position papers, attended conference panels, and met individually with judges, attorneys, and civil rights advocates. Slowly, cautiously, the tide had begun to shift. The jewelry store robbery case against Marcus Webb had been selected as the trial vehicle for this groundbreaking experiment. The case was significant enough to attract media attention, but not so complex that its resolution depended on any single factor. The accused, Marcus Webb, had allegedly committed an armed robbery at Brilliance and Light, a high-end jewelry store in downtown Sacramento's historic district. 3 customers had been present. All 3 had provided consistent descriptions of the perpetrator. The store owner had installed modern security cameras that captured clear footage. Police had recovered some of the stolen items from Webb's apartment. The case seemed straightforward, almost textbook in its clarity. There were no ambiguities that might suggest Ghost's presence could be questioned as a determining factor in the verdict. Sarah had selected Ghost specifically because of his calm demeanor. Some K9s were aggressive, reactive, or prone to distraction. Ghost possessed an unusual serenity combined with laser-focused attention when required. He understood the difference between work mode and relaxation. He'd accompanied Sarah to countless public events without becoming agitated or disruptive. Schools, shopping centers, community gatherings. Ghost had demonstrated an almost zen-like ability to remain composed in chaotic environments while maintaining complete readiness to respond when needed. Sarah believed this temperament made him ideal for courtroom observation. The Sacramento Police Department had finally approved the experiment last month. Judge Harold Chen, the presiding judge in the Webb case, had personally reviewed all documentation and interviewed Sarah extensively. Judge Chen possessed a unique perspective on K-9 capabilities. He'd served as a military officer for 22 years before pursuing law, and during his service, he'd worked alongside military working dogs in Afghanistan. He understood their value, respected their abilities, and recognized that a dog's behavior often communicated information that humans might overlook. Judge Chen had been cautiously supportive of the experiment, viewing it as an opportunity to explore new intersections between animal science and jurisprudence. Now, as Sarah looked at Ghost one final time before heading to the courthouse, she felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The media had caught wind of the experiment. Local television stations had run stories about the historic K-9 courtroom observation trial. Some coverage had been favorable, celebrating Sarah's innovative thinking and Ghost's exemplary record. Other coverage had been skeptical or outright dismissive, with legal commentators questioning whether allowing a dog in the courtroom represented progress or gimmickry. Sarah tried not to think about the potential for failure, about the possibility that Ghost might become anxious, disruptive, or behave unpredictably in the formal courtroom environment. She'd prepared Ghost extensively. For 3 weeks, she'd taken him to the courthouse during off hours, allowing him to become familiar with the space, the sounds, the smells, and the overall environment. He'd sat through mock trials where attorneys and judges rehearsed their roles, all while Ghost observed from the gallery. He'd acclimated beautifully, showing no signs of stress or anxiety. His behavior had been consistently calm and professional. Sarah had documented everything, taking notes on Ghost's responses, his body language, his level of attentiveness. Everything suggested he was ready. The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes. Sarah sat in traffic on Highway 50, Ghost beside her in the specially designed vehicle area, separated by a wire partition. She thought about her career trajectory, about the personal sacrifices she'd made to achieve this moment. She'd postponed marriage, turned down promotions that would have moved her away from K-9 work, and dedicated countless hours to studying animal behavior, law, and courtroom procedures. Her colleagues had supported her, but she knew some thought she was crazy. A dog in a courtroom. It seemed absurd on its surface. Only those who understood the depth of Ghost's training, the sophistication of his capabilities, and the potential implications of human-canine collaboration truly grasped what this moment represented. The courthouse loomed ahead, its classical architecture and imposing granite facade representing centuries of legal tradition and established procedure. Sarah took a deep breath, pulling into the designated law enforcement parking area. She grabbed Ghost's leash, double-checking his collar and ensuring his identification badge was clearly visible. The badge, specially created for this occasion, read, K-9 Ghost, Sacramento Police Department Evidence and Observation Division. It was official. This was really happening. As they walked toward the courthouse entrance, Sarah noticed television crews gathered outside, cameras and microphones ready. She guided Ghost past them with professional composure, neither hurrying nor lingering. Ghost walked with the perfect heel position, his demeanor calm and dignified. Security officers recognized Sarah and waved her through without requiring the standard screening process. They'd arranged special accommodations for Ghost, allowing him to bypass metal detectors and standard security protocols. The courtroom hallways were bustling with attorneys, court staff, and spectators. Word had spread, everyone wanted to witness history. Sarah felt the weight of attention as she walked toward the courtroom, Ghost moving silently beside her. This wasn't just another day. This was the moment everything changed, or the moment everything fell apart. Sarah couldn't know which. The courtroom doors swung open with ceremonial heaviness, revealing the formal space where justice operated according to centuries-old traditions and procedures. Sarah guided Ghost to the designated seating area in the gallery, a section that had been specifically prepared for their arrival. The bailiff had removed several audience chairs to create adequate space for a large dog to sit comfortably without impeding sightlines or creating obstruction. Sarah settled Ghost into position, running her hand along his shoulder in a reassuring gesture. The dog responded with a single tail wag, his posture immediately shifting into what Sarah called courtroom, but serene, present but unobtrusive, radiating the kind of disciplined calm that only came from extensive training and an unshakable bond with his handler. The courtroom itself was a study in institutional solemnity. High ceilings with ornate plasterwork dated back to the courthouse's construction in 1959. Polished wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lighting, supplemented by natural illumination from tall windows along the eastern wall. The judge's bench dominated the front of the space, elevated several feet above floor level, creating a visual hierarchy that reinforced judicial authority. To the left sat the witness stand, where testimony would be delivered under oath. To the right, the evidence table, a large mahogany surface where physical exhibits from the case would be displayed, examined, and entered into the record. The prosecutor's table occupied the front left position, while the defense table sat opposite. Marcus Webb already occupied his seat at the defense table, dressed in a dark suit that his attorney had clearly selected to project respectability and innocence. Spectators filled most of the gallery benches. Sarah recognized several journalists, their notebooks and recording devices at the ready. She spotted Judge Harold Chen's law clerk preparing documents at the bench. Court officers stood at strategic positions, their uniforms pristine, their demeanor professional and vigilant. Everything about the space communicated authority, tradition, and the gravity of judicial proceedings. Sarah felt Ghost's weight settling against her leg, a sign that he was comfortable and ready. She checked her watch, 9:47 a.m. The trial was scheduled to begin at 10:00 a.m. The bailiff called for order at precisely 10 o'clock. Judge Harold Chen entered from his private chambers, his black robes flowing with practiced dignity. He surveyed the courtroom, his gaze pausing briefly on Ghost. Sarah saw the slightest nod of acknowledgement, approval mixed with curiosity. Everyone stood as protocol demanded. The judge took his seat, arranged his materials, and began delivering preliminary instructions to the assembled parties. His voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to command and respect. He explained the nature of the charges against Marcus Webb: armed robbery, felony theft, and assault with a deadly weapon. The maximum sentence, if convicted on all counts, could exceed 20 years in prison. The prosecution stood first. Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres, a seasoned prosecutor with an impressive conviction record, approached the jury box. His opening statement was methodical and compelling. He described the crime with vivid detail. The moment the perpetrator entered the jewelry store, the way he'd brandished a semi-automatic pistol, his demands that the owner open the safe, and the terrifying minutes that had followed. Torres showed photographs of the stolen merchandise: gleaming diamonds, precious gemstones, intricate gold settings worth approximately $340,000. He described the courage of the store owner, Patricia Huang, who'd remained calm and compliant to protect the customers present. He introduced the security camera footage that would definitively place the perpetrator at the scene. And he described the recovered merchandise, the forensic evidence, and the overwhelming circumstantial case against Marcus Webb. Sarah listened carefully, her attention partially on Tor's narrative and partially on Ghost. The dog remained motionless, his breathing steady and regular, his eyes occasionally tracking movement in the courtroom but maintaining his composed demeanor. This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, Ghost performing his role as silent observer, neither disrupting proceedings nor drawing excessive attention. 32 minutes into Tor's opening statement, something changed. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible to anyone unfamiliar with canine body language. Ghost's ears shifted slightly, rotating forward with increased attentiveness. His breathing pattern altered almost imperceptibly, becoming more deliberate and focused. Sarah immediately recognized the signs. Her pulse accelerated slightly. She remained outwardly calm, but internally, every sense heightened into acute awareness. Ghost was detecting something. The German shepherd's muscular frame tensed almost imperceptibly. His nose began working rhythmically, sampling the air with the precision of an instrument calibrated through thousands of hours of training. Sarah watched his nostrils flare and contract, his entire olfactory system operating in overdrive. Ghost's eyes had stopped their casual scanning and now fixed with laser-like intensity on a single location, the evidence table positioned directly in front of Judge Chen's bench. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. What could Ghost have detected? The evidence table contained items related to the robbery, photographs, documents, recovered stolen merchandise, security system components, and the weapon allegedly used in the crime. Everything had been handled according to standard evidence protocols. Everything had been properly documented and sealed. Yet Ghost's behavior indicated something had activated his recognition response, something that matched his training profile so precisely that he couldn't ignore it. Ghost's whining began almost inaudibly, a sound so subtle that Sarah suspected only she could hear it clearly. But that sound meant everything. It was Ghost's primary alert indicator, his way of communicating to Sarah that he detected something significant matching his training. In 7 years of working together, Ghost had never produced a false alert. His accuracy was documented, studied, and consistently verified. When Ghost whined like this, something was genuinely present, something that matched his training in explosives detection, narcotics identification, or human remains discovery. The sound drew no immediate attention from others in the courtroom. Torres continued his opening statement, his voice projecting across the space, but Sarah felt the weight of Ghost's alert settling over her like a physical force. She maintained her external composure, her hand resting casually on Ghost's back, but internally she was analyzing possibilities and implications. What had Ghost detected? And more pressingly, what should she do about it? Ghost stood suddenly, his massive frame unfolding with purpose. Sarah hadn't commanded him to stand. He'd done so independently, driven by whatever his extraordinary olfactory system had identified. His entire body language had transformed from calm observer to active detection mode. His tail held rigid and level, his muscular body coiled with purposeful intent. His eyes remained absolutely fixed on the evidence table, never wavering, never blinking. This wasn't a dog being distracted. This wasn't an animal responding to random stimuli. This was Ghost in full alert status, communicating with absolute clarity that something had activated his training response. Sarah's heart pounded harder. Torres paused mid-sentence, his attention caught by Ghost's sudden movement. Other spectators began noticing, their heads turning toward the dog. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted almost instantly from formal judicial proceeding to something more uncertain and charged with potential significance. Judge Chen's expression changed, his eyes narrowing with interest and concern. The bailiff tensed, preparing to respond if necessary. Ghost's whining intensified, becoming more audible, more desperate, more insistent. It was the sound of a highly trained animal trying to communicate critical information to his handler. Sarah had heard this exact sound hundreds of times during training exercises and active cases. It always preceded something important. It always indicated that Ghost's nose, an organ containing approximately 300 million olfactory receptors, exponentially more sensitive than any human sensory capability, had identified something requiring immediate attention. The defense attorney, Patricia Gonzalez, began registering objections even before Ghost's behavior fully registered with everyone in the courtroom. The prosecutor looked confused, uncertain whether to continue or pause his opening statement. Spectators whispered to one another. Journalists leaned forward, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding. Ghost's alert had transformed an ordinary Tuesday morning court proceeding into something extraordinary, something that nobody had anticipated, something that would soon reveal uncomfortable truths about the very foundations of their justice system. Objection. Patricia Gonzalez's voice cut through the courtroom with sharp precision, her body rising from the defense table with practiced urgency. The defense attorney was a woman in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of penetrating gaze that had intimidated countless witnesses and opposing counsel throughout her 30-year career. She possessed an intimate knowledge of courtroom dynamics, and she immediately recognized that Ghost's behavior represented a significant threat to her client's case, whether that threat was legitimate or merely perceived. Your Honor, this animal is a clear and obvious distraction. The dog's presence and his current behavioral display are prejudicial to my client. The jury could easily misinterpret the animal's actions as some form of statement regarding my client's guilt or innocence. This violates fundamental due process protections and contaminates the integrity of these proceedings. Her argument was delivered with the kind of measured intensity that came from genuine concern, not mere theatrics. Gonzalez wasn't wrong to be worried. Juries were composed of regular human beings susceptible to suggestion, influenced by visual cues, and capable of drawing unconscious conclusions from ambiguous stimuli. If jurors perceived Ghost's alert as some form of law enforcement's canine confirmation of Webb's guilt, it could fundamentally prejudice their deliberations regardless of the actual evidence presented. The legal principle was sound. Nothing should be permitted in a courtroom that might unfairly prejudice jurors against a defendant. Michael Torres, the prosecutor, immediately rose to counter. His face had flushed slightly, whether from embarrassment or irritation was unclear. Your Honor, the dog's presence was pre-approved by this court. The animal's training and demonstrated reliability have been extensively documented. If the defense claims prejudice from the dog's mere presence, they should have objected during jury selection or pretrial motions. Attempting to use the dog's current behavior as grounds for removal is transparently strategic, an attempt to suppress evidence of the dog's legitimate capabilities that might prove damaging to the defendant. Judge Harold Chen's expression remained neutral, but his eyes communicated the weight of judicial authority and careful consideration. He held up his hand, silencing both attorneys before the argument could escalate further. Counsel approached the bench. His voice carried the kind of calm command that only came from decades of maintaining courtroom order and managing contentious legal disputes. Torres and Gonzalez both moved forward, positioning themselves at the bench's side, their voices dropping to a level intended for the judge's ears alone. Sarah watched from her seat, Ghost still in full alert status, his body language continuing to communicate urgent intensity. The whispered conversation lasted approximately 2 minutes. Sarah couldn't hear the details, but she observed Judge Chen's expressions shifting from thoughtful to concerned, to something approaching curiosity. He glanced in her direction multiple times, his gaze studying both Sarah and Ghost, with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was considering factors beyond the immediate legal arguments being presented by the attorneys. Finally, Judge Chen nodded, and the attorneys returned to their respective tables. The court will address this matter as follows, Judge Chen announced, his voice once again carrying throughout the courtroom. The dog's presence was approved following extensive documentation and legal review. However, the current behavioral display does raise legitimate questions about potential prejudice. The dog will be removed from the courtroom immediately pending a hearing on this matter. Detective Mitchell, you may remain, but your K-9 partner must exit the proceedings. Sarah's stomach dropped. This was exactly what she'd feared. Ghost's alert had triggered the very objections she'd hoped to prevent. She stood, reaching for Ghost's leash, but the dog was reluctant to move. Ghost's body remained rigid, his focus still locked on the evidence table with unwavering intensity. His whining continued, more insistent than before, as if he was trying desperately to communicate something critical before being separated from the courtroom. Your Honor, Sarah spoke up, her voice carefully controlled despite the turbulence of her emotions. "May I explain Ghost's behavior? This isn't random distraction. This is his trained, alert response indicating he's detected something." Judge Chen held up his hand, halting her explanation. "Detective Mitchell, we'll address that during the hearing. For now, please remove your K-9 from the courtroom." But Ghost wasn't cooperating. The dog began moving toward the evidence table, his powerful frame pulling Sarah forward despite her attempt to maintain control. She'd never seen Ghost behave this way, directly defying her authority, acting independently with such single-minded determination. Ghost's paws contacted the polished courtroom floor, and he began scratching audibly, his claws scraping against the hard surface with sounds that echoed throughout the suddenly silent space. It was a sound that communicated desperation, urgency, and profound determination. Everyone froze. The scratching sounds were unmistakable, undeniable, and deeply unsettling. This wasn't a dog simply being distracted or emotionally reactive. This was an animal exhibiting behavior that Sarah had rarely witnessed. Ghost was literally trying to dig at the floor, his paws working with frantic intensity as if attempting to excavate something beneath the evidence table's surface. The scratching sounds continued, each scrape of claw against floor communicating something that transcended normal dog behavior. Judge Chen's expression shifted dramatically. His eyes widened with something approaching alarm or perhaps fascination. He stood from his bench. "Stop," he commanded, his voice carrying such absolute authority that even Ghost momentarily paused. "Detective Mitchell, explain this behavior immediately. What is your dog detecting?" Sarah's mind raced through possibilities and explanations. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped Ghost's leash, pulling him away from the evidence table. "Your Honor, Ghost is trained in explosives detection, narcotics identification, and human remains discovery. When he behaves this way, the whining, the focused alert, the desperate attempt to dig, he's detecting something that matches his training profile. I honestly cannot tell you specifically what he's detected without proper investigation. Only that something has activated his recognition response with absolute certainty." The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Spectators leaned toward one another, their eyes wide with concern and curiosity. The journalists began frantically writing notes, their minds already calculating the implications of a potential explosive device or contraband in a courtroom. Patricia Gonzalez stood immediately, preparing new objections. Michael Torres looked bewildered, uncertain whether this development helped or hindered his case. Judge Chen banged his gavel once with decisive force. "Order. Bailiff, secure this courtroom. No one enters or exits. Detective Mitchell, you will remain available for immediate interview. The trial is recessed indefinitely. Evidence technicians will be called to this location immediately to investigate whatever this K-9 has detected. If there is a legitimate safety concern, we will address it. If this is a false alert, we will address that as well. But nobody leaves this courtroom until we understand what's happening." The weight of judicial authority settled over the proceedings like a physical force. Sarah stood with Ghost, feeling the eyes of everyone in the courtroom fixed upon them. Ghost had inadvertently transformed a routine felony trial into something far more significant, far more dangerous, and far more unpredictable than anyone had anticipated. Whatever Ghost had detected beneath that evidence table would soon reshape the trajectory of this entire case, and possibly the careers of multiple law enforcement officers. The courtroom transformed almost instantaneously from a formal judicial space into an active crime scene investigation area. Judge Chen's authoritative commands had set everything in motion with remarkable efficiency. Court officers cordoned off sections of the gallery using yellow caution tape, establishing perimeters and restricting access. The bailiff positioned himself at the courtroom doors, preventing anyone from entering or exiting without explicit judicial authorization. Spectators and attorneys alike sat in stunned silence, their earlier confidence and certainty replaced by palpable anxiety and uncertainty. The television cameras outside had no idea what was happening within those walls, but Sarah suspected that within hours, news vans would be surrounding the courthouse in unprecedented numbers. Sarah remained standing with Ghost, her hand resting on his neck, feeling his muscles still taut with alert intensity. The dog hadn't relaxed. His body language continued communicating that whatever he detected remained present, unresolved, and critically important. His breathing was still elevated, his nose still working the air rhythmically, his eyes still locked on the evidence table with absolute focus. Sarah had worked with Ghost long enough to understand his states of mind with remarkable precision. This wasn't the behavior of a dog who'd completed his task and was ready to move on. This was the behavior of a canine partner who'd identified something significant and was frustrated by his inability to directly access whatever his extraordinary senses had detected. Judge Chen approached Sarah directly, moving from behind his elevated bench down to the courtroom floor. His formal robe seemed to emphasize his authority as he walked toward them, his expression serious but not angry. This was a man, Sarah realized, who understood the gravity of what Ghost had signaled. Judge Chen had military experience with K-9 units, which meant he possessed genuine knowledge about canine capabilities rather than relying on misconceptions or theoretical understanding. "Detective Mitchell," Judge Chen said quietly, positioning himself so that his words were directed toward Sarah but audible to the courtroom. "I need you to explain your K-9's training and capabilities in detail. I've worked with military working dogs. I understand that these animals don't typically behave this way without legitimate cause. What specifically is Ghost trained to detect?" Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts and preparing a clear, comprehensive explanation. "Your Honor, Ghost is a multi-purpose detection canine. His primary training involves detection of explosives. He's certified to identify over 200 different explosive compounds and their precursors. Secondary training involves narcotics detection, where he's proven effective in identifying cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and various pharmaceutical compounds. Tertiary training involves human remains discovery. He's trained to detect the specific scent signatures associated with deceased individuals, which has proven valuable in missing persons cases and locating clandestine burial sites." Judge Chen nodded thoughtfully, and his accuracy rate, 98% or higher in controlled testing environments, Sarah continued. In field applications, his accuracy is documented at approximately 94%, accounting for environmental variables and handler error. False alerts are extremely rare. When Ghost exhibits the behavior he's displaying now, he's almost always detected something matching one of his training profiles. The judge's expression grew more serious. "So, if he's alerting on something in this evidence table or beneath it, we should take that seriously." "Absolutely, Your Honor," Sarah confirmed. "Ghost isn't distracted or emotionally reactive. This is his trained alert behavior. Something has activated his olfactory recognition." Evidence technicians began arriving within minutes, summoned by court officers. They carried equipment cases, cameras, documentation materials, and specialized detection devices. The lead technician, a woman named Dr. Patricia Weinstein, who Sarah recognized from previous crime scenes, approached Judge Chen with professional competence. Weinstein had worked with Sarah and Ghost on several previous cases and understood both the value and limitations of canine detection capabilities. "Judge Chen," Weinstein said, extending her hand, "I understand we have a K-9 alert situation. Can you brief me on what we're dealing with?" Judge Chen gestured toward Ghost. "Detective Mitchell's K-9 is trained in explosives detection, narcotics identification, and human remains discovery. The dog has exhibited a strong alert response directed toward the evidence table. We need to determine what's triggered the alert and assess any potential safety implications." Weinstein's expression became more focused. She immediately began setting up her equipment, while subordinate technicians photographed the courtroom from multiple angles, documenting the evidence table's position, the surrounding area, and Ghost's current location. The systematic documentation was meticulous. Nothing would be altered or examined until comprehensive photographs and measurements were recorded for potential legal proceedings and evidence preservation. "Detective Mitchell," Weinstein asked directly, "may I examine your K-9 briefly? I'd like to verify his alert status and potentially identify which specific scent signature he's responding to." Sarah nodded, guiding Ghost forward so that Weinstein could observe him more closely. The technician studied Ghost's body language, his rigid posture, his unwavering focus, his elevated breathing rate, the tension in his muscular frame. Weinstein had worked with detection canines before and understood that these physical indicators communicated genuine alert status, not false anxiety or random distraction. "This is a legitimate alert," Weinstein concluded definitively. "This dog has detected something. Let's determine what." The examination of the evidence table began systematically. Weinstein and her team documented each item, photographing sealed evidence bags, noting their condition, and carefully examining the table's structure. Approximately 6 minutes into the examination, one of the technicians, a young man named Marcus Chen, called out from the table's southern side. "Dr. Weinstein, I've found something. This evidence bag shows seal compromise. The seal is damaged." Everyone's attention immediately focused on the identified bag. Sarah leaned forward slightly, studying the evidence bag that Chen was indicating. The bag contained a single item, a latex glove allegedly bearing gunshot residue collected from the crime scene. The bag's seal, which should have been intact and unbroken, showed visible damage. The plastic had separated slightly, creating a gap between the two sealed edges that should have remained hermetically closed. Sarah's stomach tightened. A compromised evidence bag meant potential contamination. Contaminated evidence meant questionable reliability. Questionable reliability meant the entire case's integrity could be challenged. Ghost had alerted not because the evidence itself was problematic, but because the evidence's handling had been problematic. Judge Chen approached the damaged bag, examining it without touching it. His face hardened visibly. "Document this damage completely," he instructed Weinstein. "Photograph it from multiple angles, record its exact position on the table, and trace the chain of custody for this particular piece of evidence. If this bag has been compromised, we need to know when, where, and how that compromise occurred." Weinstein nodded, immediately redirecting her team's efforts toward detailed documentation of the damaged bag. The technicians scanned the evidence collection log, reviewing the handwritten notations that documented every person who'd handled the evidence since its collection at the crime scene. "There's a discrepancy here," Weinstein noted, pointing to the log. "The glove was collected at the scene at 14:47 hours. It was transported by Officer James Rodriguez to the evidence room, but there's a gap in documentation between its arrival at the evidence room and its entry into secure storage. Approximately 40 minutes where nobody signed for its custody." Judge Chen's expression became darker. He looked directly at the prosecutor. "Mr. Torres, do you have any explanation for this documentation gap in the chain of custody for this critical piece of evidence?" Michael Torres' face flushed deeply. He consulted with his team, examining the evidence log, searching for explanation. Finally, he stood, his professional composure somewhat shaken. "Your Honor, that gap wasn't apparent during my case preparation. The evidence was supposed to be continuously documented and secured. I'll investigate immediately how this discrepancy occurred." Judge Chen held up his hand. "This hearing is adjourned. All evidence collection and documentation will be immediately reviewed. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. At that time, we'll address these questions regarding evidence handling procedures, chain of custody documentation, and any potential contamination concerns. Detective Mitchell, you'll remain available. Ghost's alert may have just exposed serious problems with how evidence has been processed in this case, and potentially in other cases as well. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality, but the implications of that strike would reverberate far beyond this single trial. The courthouse hallways became a swirling vortex of activity and concern as news of the evidence compromise spread like wildfire through the judicial and law enforcement systems. Sarah sat in a small consultation room adjacent to the main courtroom, Ghost resting at her feet, while Dr. Patricia Weinstein and her evidence team conducted their comprehensive examination in the evidence room located 3 floors below. The room where Sarah waited was sterile and functional, gray walls, a single table, uncomfortable chairs, the kind of space designed for necessary conversations rather than comfort. Judge Chen had instructed her to remain available, but Sarah sensed the real reason. The court needed her proximity in case additional questions about Ghost's alert capabilities arose. The waiting was agonizing. Sarah's mind raced through numerous possibilities and implications. What exactly had Ghost detected? The damaged evidence bag suggested potential contamination, but Sarah knew from her training that Ghost's olfactory capabilities were far more sophisticated than simple detection of physical damage. He must have detected a specific scent signature, something released through the compromise in the bag seal that matched his training profile. But what? The glove supposedly contained gunshot residue, which Ghost wasn't specifically trained to detect. His alerts typically indicated explosives, narcotics, or human remains. Yet he detected something significant enough to warrant this entire investigation. A knock on the consultation room door interrupted Sarah's spiraling thoughts. A junior officer appeared, looking somewhat nervous. "Detective Mitchell, I'm Officer James Rodriguez. I understand there are questions about evidence I transported in the web case." Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. Rodriguez was the officer whose name appeared in the chain of custody documentation gap. He was young, probably early 30s, with the kind of cautious posture that suggested he was aware his professional integrity was being questioned. Sarah gestured toward a chair across from her. "Officer Rodriguez, I think you should probably speak with Judge Chen directly about this," Sarah said carefully, not wanting to conduct any informal interrogation that might compromise his legal standing. Rodriguez sat down heavily, his shoulders sagging with evident stress. "I know what it looks like. There was an issue with that evidence bag. When I transported it from the crime scene to the evidence room, the bag was in my patrol vehicle. I stopped at a convenience store just for 5 minutes to grab a coffee. I left the evidence bag on the dashboard while I went inside. When I came back out, the bag was still there, but I realized I shouldn't have left it unattended. I documented it properly in the chain of custody when I delivered it to the evidence room, but I didn't mention the convenience store stop because..." He trailed off, his face reddening with obvious shame and regret. Sarah felt a complex mixture of sympathy and concern. Rodriguez had made a significant procedural error, the kind of mistake that could undermine an entire investigation. Leaving evidence unattended, even for a few minutes, violated basic chain of custody protocols. The evidence could have been tampered with, contaminated, or subjected to environmental conditions that compromised its integrity. "Officer Rodriguez, I think you need to speak with an attorney before discussing this further," Sarah advised gently. "What you're describing is a serious procedural violation. It's not my place to interrogate you about it." Rodriguez nodded miserably and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Sarah sat back in her chair, absorbing the implications of what he just revealed. Ghost hadn't alerted on the glove's contents. He'd alerted on something that had been introduced to the bag during the period when it sat unattended on a patrol car dashboard. What could that be? Environmental contamination from the vehicle's interior, exposure to atmospheric conditions, or something more intentional. 3 hours later, Dr. Weinstein entered the consultation room, looking exhausted but grimly determined. She carried a leather portfolio containing her preliminary findings. "Detective Mitchell, we need to talk about what Ghost detected," Weinstein said, settling herself across from Sarah. "What did you find?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the tension she felt but couldn't fully suppress. Weinstein opened her portfolio, revealing numerous photographs and test results. The damaged evidence bag contained 3 distinct scent signatures that triggered Ghost's alert. First, residual traces of an accelerant, specifically gasoline, present on the glove's surface. Second, microscopic fibers consistent with automotive upholstery, suggesting the glove had been in contact with a vehicle's interior. Third, trace amounts of a substance we initially couldn't identify, which our rapid test equipment suggests might be a controlled substance precursor. Sarah's eyes widened. Gasoline? That doesn't match the crime scene evidence at all. The robbery occurred at a jewelry store, not anywhere involving accelerants and automotive fibers. Exactly, Weinstein confirmed. The glove's original gunshot residue contamination is still present, but it's been compromised by secondary exposure to these other substances. Ghost detected all of this, the presence of multiple scent signatures that shouldn't be on that glove if it had been properly secured since collection at the crime scene. "So Officer Rodriguez's convenience store stop," Sarah began. "Likely introduced the gasoline and automotive fibers," Weinstein finished. "The vehicle's interior, exposure to atmospheric conditions, potential contact with the vehicle's fuel system, all of this could explain the secondary contamination. But here's what concerns me most. We're finding similar contamination patterns on multiple other pieces of evidence from this case." Sarah stood abruptly, her mind reeling with the implications. Multiple pieces. At least 8 other evidence bags show signs of compromise, mishandling, or contamination, Weinstein reported grimly. "We're documenting everything, but Detective Mitchell, this case's entire evidentiary foundation is questionable. The prosecution's case relies heavily on physical evidence and forensic analysis. If multiple pieces of evidence have been compromised, the reliability of those analyses becomes deeply suspect." An hour later, Sarah stood in Judge Chen's private chambers, presenting these findings to the judge in person. Judge Chen listened carefully, his expression growing darker as Weinstein detailed the scope of the contamination and procedural violations. When Weinstein finished, the judge sat silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before his face, his entire demeanor communicating the weight of the decision he faced. "This is extraordinarily serious," Judge Chen said finally. "We have multiple pieces of compromised evidence, documentation gaps, and procedural violations that have directly compromised the integrity of the evidence collection and storage process. The prosecution's case depends on the reliability of this physical evidence. If that reliability is now suspect, the entire case's foundation crumbles." He stood and began packing his chambers, clearly struggling with the judicial and ethical implications of what had been revealed. "Detective Mitchell, your K-9 partner may have just exposed not just a problem with this case, but systematic failures in how this department handles evidence. I need to consider how to proceed. The defendant, Marcus Webb, deserves a trial based on reliable evidence and proper procedures. But I also need to ensure that any findings we make today don't unfairly prejudice other cases." Judge Chen paused at his window, looking out over Sacramento's downtown area. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to order a comprehensive audit of all evidence handling procedures in this precinct. I'm going to request that the prosecutor's office conduct an immediate review of all cases where the same officers handled evidence. And I'm going to allow the defense access to all of these findings, which will almost certainly lead to a motion for mistrial based on compromised evidence." He turned back to face Sarah and Weinstein directly. "Your dog, Detective Mitchell, has done more than expose problems in this single case. Ghost has revealed systematic failures that could affect numerous prosecutions. This is both a triumph for justice and a profound embarrassment for law enforcement. I need to ensure that we handle the aftermath with absolute integrity and transparency." Sarah felt the weight of that statement settle over her. Ghost hadn't simply alerted on a piece of evidence. He'd exposed institutional failures, procedural negligence, and the kind of systemic problems that could wrongfully convict innocent people or allow guilty parties to escape justice due to contaminated evidence. The unraveling had only just begun, and Sarah knew that the coming days would fundamentally challenge how the Sacramento Police Department approached evidence handling and chain of custody protocols. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when proceedings resumed the following morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, with additional spectators standing along the walls and crowding into the available floor space. Television crews had positioned themselves strategically throughout the hallway outside, their cameras and microphones ready to capture any statement or development. The media had transformed the web case into a major news story overnight, with headlines screaming across local and regional news outlets. K9 alert exposes evidence tampering, chain of custody failures in major robbery case, and systematic police evidence mishandling alleged. Sarah sat in the same gallery seat where she'd been the previous day, Ghost beside her, but the atmosphere had transformed entirely. Yesterday's uncertainty had crystallized into something far more serious and consequential. Judge Chen entered the courtroom with visible gravity written across his features. His black robe seemed to carry additional weight, as if the responsibility of addressing what had been revealed was physically pressing down upon him. He took his bench, surveyed the courtroom with a deliberate gaze that communicated the seriousness with which he viewed the proceedings, and began speaking without preamble or pleasantries. "This court is now in session regarding the matter of People v. Marcus Webb," Judge Chen announced formally. Yesterday's proceedings revealed significant and troubling evidence handling violations that directly compromise the integrity of the physical evidence upon which the prosecution's case substantially relies. Before we proceed further, I am ordering a comprehensive disclosure of all findings from yesterday's evidence examination to both the prosecution and the defense, effective immediately. He gestured toward Dr. Weinstein, who distributed detailed reports documenting the contamination, the procedural violations, and the chain of custody failures. Michael Torres received his copy with visible dismay written across his face. Patricia Gonzalez reviewed her copy with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she was already formulating arguments and strategic responses. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, his expression shifting from fearful to cautiously hopeful as he absorbed what the reports contained. "The court also finds," Judge Chen continued with measured authority, "that Officer James Rodriguez's decision to leave evidence unattended in his personal vehicle, combined with the failure to document this departure from standard procedure, constitutes a serious violation of chain of custody protocols. This violation has resulted in documented contamination of critical evidence. Furthermore, the evidence room's documentation gaps and the apparent lack of proper secure storage procedures represent systematic failures that extend beyond this single case." Torres stood abruptly. "Your Honor, may I address the court? While we acknowledge the procedural violations, the core evidence in this case, the security camera footage, the eyewitness testimony, and the recovered stolen merchandise, remain uncompromised. The contamination affects only peripheral evidence. The prosecution's case does not depend solely on the compromised physical evidence." Patricia Gonzalez rose immediately to respond, her voice carrying sharp precision. "Your Honor, the prosecution cannot simply dismiss contaminated evidence as peripheral when the defense hasn't had adequate opportunity to fully examine the implications of that contamination. More troublingly, this situation reveals systematic failures in how this police department handles evidence. If these failures affected this case, they likely affected numerous other cases. How many defendants have been prosecuted based on compromised evidence? How many innocent people might be incarcerated due to these procedures? This isn't just about Marcus Webb anymore. This is about the integrity of the entire justice system in this jurisdiction. The courtroom erupted in animated discussion. Journalists scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Judge Chen banged his gavel once, commanding silence. Order in this courtroom. He paused, allowing the noise to settle, before continuing with deliberate authority. The court acknowledges the defense's concerns regarding systematic implications. Therefore, I am ordering the following. First, all evidence handling procedures within the Sacramento Police Department will undergo immediate comprehensive audit by an independent external firm. Second, the prosecution will conduct a complete review of all felony cases handled by officers involved in the current evidence mishandling situation, with particular attention to any cases where physical evidence played a critical role in prosecution or conviction. Third, the defense will receive complete access to all audit findings and case reviews within 30 days. Fourth, this court will schedule a hearing to determine whether any previously convicted individuals should have their cases reopened based on potential evidence handling violations. Torres looked as though he'd been physically struck. The implications of Judge Chen's orders extended far beyond the current trial. A comprehensive audit could reveal similar violations in dozens or hundreds of other cases. Previously convicted individuals might successfully appeal their convictions. The entire prosecutorial framework that Torres had built his career upon was being subjected to intensive scrutiny and potential invalidation. Furthermore, Judge Chen continued with increasing gravity, I am issuing a directive to the Sacramento Police Chief requesting a complete investigation into how these evidence-handling violations occurred and persisted. Someone in the chain of command failed to implement or enforce proper procedures. That responsibility must be identified and addressed. Patricia Gonzalez seized the moment. Your Honor, based on these revelations and the systematic nature of the evidence-handling failures, the defense moves for an immediate mistrial. The compromised evidence, the procedural violations, and the newly revealed systematic failures have rendered this defendant unable to receive a fair trial under these circumstances. Furthermore, the defense moves for complete dismissal of charges against Marcus Webb, as the prosecution's case has been fundamentally undermined by its own department's negligence and misconduct. Torres stood to object, but Judge Chen held up his hand before the prosecutor could speak. The court will take these motions under advisement. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. At that time, I will rule on the mistrial motion and address the defense's motion for dismissal. In the interim, I strongly encourage both sides to engage in serious settlement negotiations. The people may wish to consider whether continued prosecution is appropriate given the compromised evidentiary foundation. He banged his gavel with finality. This court is adjourned. The courtroom exploded into activity. Journalists rushed toward the exits, anxious to file their stories. Spectators discussed the implications in hushed but animated tones. Marcus Webb looked toward Patricia Gonzalez with desperate hope. Officer Rodriguez, sitting in the gallery with his union representative, appeared profoundly devastated. Torres huddled with his prosecution team, their expressions ranging from shock to anger to apparent recognition that their case was crumbling before their eyes. Sarah sat quietly with Ghost, watching the chaos unfold around her. The dog, somehow sensing the gravity of the situation, remained calm and composed, his presence projecting a strange serenity amid the storm of activity. Sarah ran her hand along Ghost's shoulder, feeling the solid reality of his muscular frame, grounding herself in the physical reality of what had occurred. Her K-9 partner had inadvertently exposed not the guilt or innocence of a single defendant, but the fragility and fallibility of the justice system itself. Outside the courtroom, news reporters ambushed Sarah as she and Ghost attempted to navigate the hallway. Microphones thrust toward her, questions shouted in overlapping succession. Detective Mitchell, did you anticipate your dog would reveal evidence tampering? Do you think this will affect the verdict? Has your department responded to the allegations? Sarah moved forward with Ghost, refusing to comment, allowing her dog's steady presence to carry them through the media gauntlet. That evening, Sarah sat in her home office, Ghost resting on his orthopedic bed beside her desk, while her supervisor, Captain Maria Rodriguez, called with updates. "Mitchell, you've stirred up a hornet's nest," Rodriguez said without preamble. "The chief is in full crisis management mode. We're implementing emergency procedures for evidence handling. The prosecutor's office is in chaos, and the media is having a field day suggesting systemic corruption and negligence." "Captain, Ghost simply alerted on contaminated evidence," Sarah replied carefully. "The violations were real. The contamination was real. These problems existed before Ghost's alert. He just revealed them." "I know," Rodriguez said, her voice softening slightly. "And frankly, that's probably going to save this department from much worse consequences down the road. Better to address these problems now under controlled circumstances than have them explode during some major case or public scandal. But understand that you're now at the center of a very significant and very public situation. The department is going to want to capitalize on Ghost's positive contributions while managing the negative implications for our procedures. You're about to become very famous, detective." After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence, stroking Ghost's ears while he dozed peacefully. The dog had no understanding of the chaos he'd caused, no comprehension that his simple alert had set in motion events that would reverberate through the entire justice system. He'd simply performed his training, responded to scent signatures, and communicated what his extraordinary nose had detected. Everything that followed had been human interpretation, human institutional response, and human confrontation with uncomfortable truths about systematic failures and institutional negligence. Tomorrow, Judge Chen would rule on the mistrial motion. The day after, the implications would begin spreading throughout the prosecutorial and law enforcement communities. And Ghost, the humble police dog whose only crime was being exceptionally good at his job, would become an unlikely symbol of accountability and systemic reform. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows as Sarah sat in the gallery, Ghost beside her, waiting for Judge Chen to deliver his ruling on the mistrial motion. The courtroom was, if possible, even more crowded than it had been the previous day. The media presence had intensified exponentially overnight. Every major news outlet in California had picked up the story. National news networks were beginning to show interest in what was being framed as a systemic failure in law enforcement evidence handling. Sarah had received calls from law enforcement agencies across the country, from legal scholars, from civil rights organizations, all wanting to understand how Ghost's alert had exposed such profound institutional problems. Judge Chen entered the courtroom precisely at 9 o'clock. His expression communicated the weight of the decision he was about to announce. He settled himself at his bench, arranged his papers with deliberate precision, and began speaking without preamble. "This court has thoroughly reviewed the evidence presented regarding the contamination, the chain of custody violations, and the systematic failures revealed through the K-9's alert and subsequent investigation. The court finds that the prosecution's case has been fundamentally compromised by these violations. Evidence that was supposed to be maintained under strict security and documentation protocols has instead been subjected to contamination, inadequate storage, and procedural violations that render its reliability questionable. Under these circumstances, this court cannot, in good conscience, permit this trial to proceed with confidence that the defendant can receive a fair adjudication based on reliable evidence." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before continuing. "Therefore, this court grants the defense motion for mistrial. Furthermore, this court is inclined to grant the defense motion for dismissal of charges against Marcus Webb, pending the prosecution's opportunity to present argument regarding whether charges should be refiled based on properly collected and maintained evidence. Michael Torres stood, his face flushed with visible frustration and concern. "Your Honor, the prosecution respectfully requests the opportunity to address the court regarding the proposed dismissal. While we acknowledge the procedural violations, the core evidence in this case, the security camera footage and eyewitness testimony, remain valid and reliable. We believe the case can be successfully retried with proper evidence procedures going forward." Judge Chen nodded. "The court will entertain arguments on this matter. However, I must advise the prosecution that proceeding with a retrial will require complete recollection and reprocessing of all physical evidence under the new protocols that will shortly be implemented. This will require substantial additional investigative effort and expense. The court recommends careful consideration of whether such effort is proportionate to the circumstances, and whether justice might be better served through other means." The implication was clear. Judge Chen was suggesting that the prosecution might consider accepting the charge's dismissal rather than investing substantial resources in a retrial with uncertain outcomes given the compromised evidence. Torres sat down, conferring quietly with his team, his expression communicating the weight of the impossible choice facing him. 3 hours later, after extensive negotiations between the prosecution and defense, Torres stood and announced that the people would not pursue immediate retrial. Instead, the prosecution would conduct a comprehensive reinvestigation of the robbery, including recollection of physical evidence and re-interviewing of all witnesses. If sufficient evidence could be gathered through proper procedures, charges would be refiled. If not, the case would be permanently dismissed. Marcus Webb, sitting at the defense table, visibly relaxed, understanding that he would be released pending potential future proceedings. Judge Chen banged his gavel, sealing the decision. "Marcus Webb, you are hereby released from custody pending any future proceedings. The charges against you are hereby dismissed without prejudice, meaning the prosecution retains the right to refile charges if proper evidence can be developed. However, this dismissal sends a clear message to all involved parties. Evidence handling failures will not be tolerated, and prosecutions that depend on compromised evidence will not proceed. Court is adjourned." 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in Police Commissioner James Reynolds' office, a space that commanded views of downtown Sacramento and carried the weight of institutional authority. Reynolds was a career law enforcement officer in his early 60s, with the kind of weathered features that suggested decades of difficult decisions and weighty responsibilities. He'd called Sarah to his office personally, requesting her immediate presence. "Detective Mitchell, what you and your K-9 have inadvertently exposed represents both a profound embarrassment and an extraordinary opportunity for this department," Reynolds began without preamble. "Our evidence handling procedures were clearly inadequate. Our oversight mechanisms failed. Officers violated basic chain of custody protocols with apparent impunity. But now we have the opportunity to implement systemic reforms that will protect both defendants' rights and the integrity of our prosecutions." He paused, sliding a folder across his desk toward Sarah. Inside were detailed documents outlining a new organizational structure. "I'm creating a new division within the Sacramento Police Department, the K-9 Evidence Integrity Unit. This division will be responsible for implementing random audits of evidence rooms, verifying chain of custody documentation, ensuring that evidence storage procedures are properly followed, and deploying specially trained K-9s to identify potential contamination or procedural violations before they compromise cases. I want you to lead this division." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise and genuine shock. This represented a significant career advancement, a position of substantial authority and responsibility. "Commissioner Reynolds, I'm honored by the opportunity, but I'm a detective, not an administrator. My background is K-9 handling, not management." "Then you'll learn," Reynolds replied with firm authority. Your K-9 has demonstrated the value of canine involvement in evidence integrity. Now we need to formalize and systematize that capability. You understand both the dogs and the procedures. You have credibility with the law enforcement community and with the judiciary. You're the right person for this position. He stood, extending his hand across the desk. Detective Sarah Mitchell, welcome to your new position as director of the K-9 Evidence Integrity Unit. You'll have authority to hire and train additional K-9 handlers, to implement new protocols, and to work directly with the prosecutor's office and judicial system to ensure that evidence handling meets the highest standards. Sarah shook his hand, the implications of the position settling over her like a mantle of responsibility. Thank you, Commissioner. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Reynolds said with apparent confidence. And your dog, Ghost, deserves formal recognition for his service. I'm recommending him for the Medal of Valor, which is typically reserved for dogs who have prevented loss of life or apprehended dangerous criminals. But Ghost prevented something equally important, the conviction of an innocent person based on compromised evidence. That's heroism of a different kind. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a newly constructed training facility in Auburn, California, located approximately 30 miles northeast of downtown Sacramento. The facility was purpose-built for the K-9 Evidence Integrity Unit, equipped with mock evidence rooms, specialized training areas, and classroom space for officer education. Sarah had hired 5 additional K-9 handlers, selected their dogs carefully for temperament and trainability, and personally overseen their training in evidence integrity protocols. Ghost, now 9 years old and transitioning into semi-retirement, served as the unit's unofficial mascot and training model. The dog still possessed his remarkable olfactory capabilities, but Sarah had modified his work schedule to reduce stress and allow him adequate recovery time. Ghost spent most of his days resting comfortably at the training facility, occasionally participating in demonstrations for new officers and handlers, but primarily enjoying the leisure he'd earned through years of distinguished service. A group of young officers and newly assigned K-9 handlers gathered in the training facility's classroom, attentively listening as Sarah conducted her morning briefing. The purpose of this unit is clear and straightforward, Sarah explained, gesturing toward documents on the wall that outlined their mandate. We exist to ensure that evidence handling procedures meet the highest standards of security, documentation, and integrity. We deploy our K-9s to identify potential contamination before it compromises cases. We audit evidence rooms to verify that procedures are being followed correctly. We train officers in proper chain of custody documentation, and we work closely with the prosecutor's office and judicial system to catch problems before they result in mistrial situations or compromised convictions. She paused, looking at the assembled officers with direct authority. This unit exists because a police dog alerted on compromised evidence in a robbery case. That alert exposed systematic failures that could have continued indefinitely, potentially resulting in wrongful convictions or cases being dismissed due to procedural violations. Our job is to prevent that from happening again. Every case that proceeds based on reliable evidence is a success. Every contamination we identify before it reaches trial is a victory for justice. One of the new handlers raised her hand. Detective Mitchell, what happened to the defendant in the original case, Marcus Webb? Mr. Webb was released and the charges were eventually dismissed, Sarah explained. The prosecution conducted a complete reinvestigation of the robbery using proper evidence procedures. They determined they had insufficient properly collected evidence to proceed with prosecution. So Marcus Webb was released and went back to his life. He'd been in custody for approximately 6 months due to procedures that violated his rights. Our evidence integrity work now helps ensure that doesn't happen to others. Ghost, lying on his orthopedic bed at the front of the classroom, lifted his head as if acknowledging the mention of his role in those events. The officers smiled, recognizing the dog's significance in their work's foundation. Sarah concluded her briefing and dismissed the officers to their training assignments. As they filed out, she remained in the classroom with Ghost, sitting beside the dog's bed and stroking his ears gently. The dog's eyes closed contentedly, his breathing steady and peaceful. "You did good work, old friend," Sarah said softly, speaking to the dog as if he could understand her words. "You exposed problems that needed exposing. You protected someone who needed protecting, and you changed how an entire system operates. That's a remarkable legacy for any officer, human or canine." Ghost's tail thumped once against his bed in response, his way of acknowledging Sarah's words and affirming the bond that had sustained them through 7 years of distinguished service together. 3 years later, Sarah stood before an auditorium filled with law enforcement officers, legal professionals, academic researchers, and media representatives at the annual California Law Enforcement Conference in San Diego. The auditorium's high ceiling and stadium seating accommodated nearly 800 attendees, all gathered to hear her present findings from the K-9 Evidence Integrity Unit's first 3 years of operation. On a large screen behind her, photographs of Ghost displayed throughout different stages of his career, as a younger dog in active investigations, during his courtroom alert, and in his current semi-retired state. Sarah had become something of a minor celebrity in law enforcement and judicial circles. Her work had transformed how multiple states approached evidence handling. Other departments had established similar K-9 units modeled on Sacramento's program. Legal scholars had published extensively on the implications of Ghost's courtroom alert. Universities had incorporated the case into their law enforcement and criminal justice curricula. And Sarah herself had been invited to speak at conferences, contribute to policy discussions, and serve as a consultant to agencies implementing evidence integrity protocols. Over the past 3 years, Sarah began her presentation, her voice clear and confident. The K-9 Evidence Integrity Unit has conducted audits of 217 evidence rooms across California. We've identified and corrected over 400 instances of procedural violations, contamination risks, or documentation failures before those problems could compromise cases. We've prevented at least 14 potential miscarriages of justice by identifying evidence contamination that would have remained undetected through conventional audit procedures. She advanced to the next slide, which displayed statistical data compiled from the unit's operations. More significantly, we've trained over 300 law enforcement officers in proper evidence handling procedures. We've established a certification program for evidence room managers. We've implemented standardized protocols adopted by 57 law enforcement agencies across California. And we've demonstrated conclusively that K-9 detection capabilities can identify subtle contamination that human inspection alone would miss. The auditorium was silent, absorbing the presentation's implications. Sarah could see attorneys, judges, and law enforcement professionals taking notes, their expressions communicating genuine interest in the material being presented. "The genesis of this entire program," Sarah continued, projecting a photograph of Ghost from the Webb courtroom case, "was one dog's alert to compromised evidence in a routine felony trial. Ghost didn't understand he was exposing systemic failures. He didn't comprehend that his behavior would trigger investigations affecting hundreds of cases and thousands of individuals. He simply performed his training, responding to olfactory stimuli that matched his preparation. But his alert revealed uncomfortable truths about institutional procedures and human failures that had been accumulating unnoticed for years." She paused, allowing the significance of that statement to settle over the audience. Justice isn't just about determining guilt or innocence based on evidence. Justice requires that the evidence itself be reliable, that procedures be followed with consistency, and that systems be designed to prevent the kind of contamination and procedural violations that compromise both defendants' rights and the integrity of convictions. Ghost's alert taught us that lesson in a way that internal audits and policy reviews never could have achieved. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her hotel suite in San Diego, video calling home to check on Ghost. Her partner, Dr. Marcus Chen, no relation to the judge, answered the phone, holding it so that Sarah could see Ghost resting on their back porch, enjoying the evening California breeze. "How's he doing?" Sarah asked, her voice warm with affection for the dog she'd worked with for nearly a decade. "He's good," Marcus replied. "Ate well today, took a nice walk this morning, and he's been napping most of the afternoon. He's showing his age, Sarah. The vet says his hips are starting to give him trouble. We might need to consider more frequent visits to the specialist." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of emotions: gratitude for Ghost's long and healthy life, concern about his aging, and recognition of the finite nature of their time together. Ghost was 10 years old now, which was respectable for a large breed dog, but positioned him clearly in his senior years. "Let's schedule a comprehensive checkup when I get back. We want to ensure he's as comfortable as possible." "Already planned," Marcus assured her. "He's still got good quality of life, Sarah. Don't worry too much. Ghost has earned his retirement." After they said goodbye, Sarah sat on the hotel balcony overlooking San Diego Bay, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that Ghost had taken her on. From a routine police dog fulfilling his training to an inadvertent catalyst for systemic reform, Ghost had changed her life, her career, and the lives of hundreds of people whose cases had been affected by improved evidence handling procedures. 1 year later, Sarah attended Ghost's retirement ceremony at the Sacramento Police Academy. The event had been organized by Commissioner Reynolds and attended by numerous officers, judges, prosecutors, and media representatives. Ghost, now visibly aged but still dignified, wore a special ceremonial collar adorned with medals and commendations representing his years of service. His muzzle had grayed considerably. His movements were slower and more careful, but his eyes still carried that same intelligent alertness that had characterized him throughout his career. Judge Harold Chen attended the ceremony, speaking publicly about Ghost's role in exposing evidence handling violations that had affected dozens of cases. "This dog," Judge Chen said, gesturing toward Ghost, "demonstrated that justice requires more than conviction. Justice requires integrity in every aspect of the system, from evidence collection through trial. Ghost's alert in my courtroom revealed that we had failed in that fundamental obligation. His alert gave us the opportunity to correct those failures and implement reforms that will protect defendants' rights for years to come." Patricia Gonzalez, the defense attorney from the original web case, also spoke. "I've been a defense attorney for 30 years. I've fought countless battles against evidence mishandling and procedural violations, but it took a police dog to finally force systemic change. Ghost exposed what human oversight had missed. His contribution to justice extends far beyond the Marcus web case. He's helped ensure that the integrity of evidence becomes a priority in law enforcement agencies across this state." Sarah stood beside Ghost during the ceremony, her hand resting on his shoulder, feeling the solid reality of his muscular frame even as she recognized the effects of aging. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah kept her remarks brief and focused. "Ghost came into my life 7 years before his courtroom alert," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. "He was a remarkable working dog, dedicated, intelligent, and unfailingly accurate in his detection work. But what Ghost did in Judge Chen's courtroom transcended his training. He exposed systemic failures that nobody else had identified. He protected someone who needed protecting, and he sparked reforms that have affected hundreds of cases and thousands of lives." Ghost didn't understand the implications of his alert. He was simply doing what he'd been trained to do. But that simplicity, That commitment to his fundamental purpose revealed what we had been overlooking. Ghost teaches us that integrity in small things creates integrity in the system as a whole. She paused, looking directly at the assembled crowd. Ghost is retiring now. He's earned that rest, but his legacy will continue through the K-9 Evidence Integrity Unit, through the officers he trained, and through the cases that will proceed with evidence reliability that Ghost helped ensure. I'm grateful for his service, proud of his accomplishments, and humbled to have been his partner. 2 years later, on a quiet autumn morning in Sacramento, Sarah sat in her home office with Ghost resting peacefully in his orthopedic bed. The dog had slowed considerably in recent months, his energy diminished, his movements more labored. He was 12 years old now, which exceeded the typical lifespan for large-breed dogs. Sarah's veterinarian had gently suggested that Ghost's quality of life was beginning to decline, that his pain levels were increasing, and that she should begin considering end-of-life care decisions. Ghost's eyes opened slightly as Sarah sat beside his bed, running her fingers gently along his gray muzzle. The dog's tail thumped softly, his way of acknowledging her presence even in his diminished state. Sarah reflected on everything Ghost had accomplished, everything he'd meant to her, and the profound impact he'd had on the justice system through one remarkable alert in a Sacramento courtroom. "You did good work, old friend," Sarah whispered, the same words she'd spoken to him years earlier at the training facility. "You protected innocent people. You exposed corruption and negligence. You changed how an entire system operates. And you did it all by simply doing your job, by being true to your training and your purpose. That's a legacy that will endure far beyond your lifetime." Ghost's breathing became more shallow, his movements more minimal, but his eyes remained focused on Sarah's face, the bond between handler and K-9 partner transcending the physical limitations of aging. Sarah understood that Ghost's time was limited, that the remarkable dog who'd shaped her career and influenced law enforcement reform across an entire state was approaching the end of his journey. She thought about that pivotal moment in Judge Chen's courtroom, when Ghost's alert had frozen the proceedings and set in motion a chain of events that nobody could have anticipated. Ghost hadn't been trying to change the system. He hadn't understood the implications of his behavior. He'd simply responded to his training, to his extraordinary olfactory capabilities, to his fundamental purpose as a detection dog. And in doing so, he'd revealed uncomfortable truths about institutional failures and human negligence that had needed exposing. Ghost's legacy wasn't just about evidence handling procedures or courtroom reforms. It was about the fundamental importance of integrity, of dedication to purpose, of commitment to doing one's job thoroughly and honestly. Ghost had demonstrated that a single individual, or in this case, a single dog, could change systems, influence policy, and protect countless people through nothing more than faithful adherence to training and purpose. As Sarah sat beside Ghost's bed in the quiet of her home office, she recognized that his remarkable journey was entering its final chapter. But his impact would endure, carried forward through the officers he'd trained, the cases he'd helped protect, and the systemic reforms he'd inspired. Ghost had proven that justice depends not just on finding guilt or innocence, but on ensuring that the entire system operates with honesty, integrity, and absolute commitment to protecting the rights of all individuals who pass through its processes. The remarkable German Shepherd, whose alert in a Sacramento courtroom had frozen judicial proceedings and exposed systemic failures, had earned his rest. But his legacy would continue, generation after generation, protecting the innocent and ensuring that the pursuit of justice remained forever grounded in the fundamental principle that Ghost had embodied throughout his distinguished career. That integrity in small things creates integrity in everything.